I've got 5 putty knives and scrapers that I've collected from flea markets and yard sales. I didn't pay more than $1 for any one of these. They are all similarly constructed with steel blades and wood handle scales. The ones with thicker blades would probably be considered scrapers, while the thinner, more flexible blades would be putty knives. I thought it would be interesting to clean them up, experimenting with different finishing techniques. I scraped the worst of the corrosion off of all of the blades with a razor blade. I used my Dremel and my homemade Scotch-Brite discs to clean up the blade on the Russell 530-3 scraper. I also touched up the sides of the blade with a file. I used steel wool to clean up the wood scales. A gun bore brush came in handy for the hollow pin. I finished the whole thing off with a coat of paste wax. For the next scraper, I decided to hand sand the blade. I started with 150 grit and worked my way all the way down to 1000 grit. Then I polished the metal by hand with my flits. I hand sanded the wood scales down to 320 grit. I couldn't remove the light colored caulk or paint that had found its way deep into the grain. I tried staining the wood with dark walnut to help hide the light spots. I also hand sanded the blade on the third scraper. When hand sanding, I try to change sanding directions as I change grits. I also use flits to polish this blade, but this time I did it with my Dremel and the soft, puffy polishing wheel. I used my Dremel and my Scotch-Brite wheels to polish the bolsters and the wood scales. I used my belt sander on the blade of the fourth putty knife. I started with a 120 grit belt and worked my way down to 800. Instead of flits, I used emery compound and the buffing wheel to polish the blade. The blade got pretty warm, so I opted for gloves. The scales were loose on the end, so I used a punch to tighten up the hollow rivet. The wood scales had some paint on them, so I sanded them lightly with 220 grit. I noticed the brass-colored rivets were actually plated steel. I tried some reddish-brown shoe polish on the wood scales. I got this idea from watching Joe's shop, where he tried some colored wax on a handle. I applied several coats to build up the color. This last putty knife was my favorite of the bunch. I used my Dremel and Scotch-Brite wheels to clean up the blade. The pitting was very deep, and I thought the Scotch-Brite would be the best option for getting into the nooks and crannies. I used my Dremel and the flits to polish the blade. I opted for the more aggressive felt polishing wheel. I decided to try wet sanding the bolsters and the wood scales. I wet sanded with water down to 2000 grit. I used the white rouge I usually use on plastic to try to polish the wood. I used a soft, puffy polishing wheel and a light touch. Okay, now for some before and after footage. This Russell 530-3 had a super stiff blade. I opted for the Scotch-Brite discs on the blade and steel wool on the bolsters and wood scales. This scraper was the only one in the group without metal bolsters. Remember how I tried to use stain to hide the paint or caulk that was caught in the grain? Oh well, at least the big brass rivets look good. The hand-sanded and hand-flitzed blade came out pretty well. The third scraper was one of 2 that had brass-colored steel rivets. I was disappointed that the brass color came off in the cleaning process. The wood scales were polished with the fine Scotch-Brite discs and waxed. The blade was hand-sanded and Dremel polished with flits. This is the blade I opted to belt sand. I took off a lot of material, but I achieved a mirror finish. I think the shoe polish did a nice job on the wood scales. I'll have to keep that in my bag of tricks. Last but not least is the ugly duckling of the bunch. Look how beat up that blade was. I wish we had feel-o-vision. The wood scales feel glass smooth after wet sanding and polishing with the white rouge. The blade turned out pretty shiny. The pitting was so deep and the blade was so thin, if I had tried to sand out the pits, there would have been no blade left. I always keep an eye out for old wood-handled putty knives and scrapers. I can usually pick them up for $1 or less. I get really excited when I find one with metal bolsters and brass pins. In my opinion, you just can't beat steel, wood, and brass vintage tools. It was fun trying different finishing techniques on both the metal blades and the wood scales. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. A viewer recently asked if I display my restored items. I thought I'd give everyone another look at my project pegboard. Every item you see was a 357 Magdad video.